Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we revisit the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, examining its enduring impact on Northern Ireland and the complex challenges it faces today. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, this panel discussion features David Donoghue, a key negotiator of the agreement, Gerry Foley, broadcast journalist and writer Kerri Dochartaigh.
Thanks very much. Brilliant to see so many of you here, actually, because it's been such a wonderful and varied festival. We're wondering how many people still have the appetite on a Saturday afternoon. But it'd be well worth your time, because these are two very strong books, very different perspectives of the Good Friday Agreement growing up in the North. So by way of brief introduction before we go to, by the way, if those of you who are expecting Philip Stevens from the Financial Times, none of us are Philip Stevens from the Financial Times. Luckily, as it turned out, but more than capable and very interesting perspective, which will come from Kerri Dochartaigh and her book Thin Places, which is a very interesting mix of memoir, but your love of nature, the healing power of nature, but your story itself, which we'll cover in some detail, is a fascinating one, and it shows the real trauma of growing up during the Troubles. David Donoghue then was a very senior Irish diplomat who ended up being Irish ambassador not only to the United Nations but also to Germany. But crucially for these purposes, he was based in Northern Ireland for a long while and was in the room all of that crucial week when the Good Friday Agreement was eventually signed on April the 10th, 1998. And the last 36 hours, I don't know if we all remember the series with Jack Bauer, 24, Kiefer Sutherland. You could make a TV series, because hour by hour, everything changed. And they weren't quite sure from 1 hour to the next, are we ever going to get this across the line? And that's what is so tense and dramatic and important about this as a record of just how the talks eventually produced an agreement, flawed as it was and remains to this day. My name briefly is Gerry Foley. I'm a journalist. I come from the south of Ireland. I worked for Irish television in the early 80s, but then I spent 4 years in Belfast between 84 and 88 during a very difficult time in terms of violence on the streets, limited political engagement before heading off to Westminster and spending a lot of time there. First time at Bradford, thank you very much for the invite, but I've done a lot of book festivals, so hopefully that will help me guide here. So let's just start. David, your grandfather worked in the North and didn't have a particularly happy time. So just give us a brief family tree. And Kerri, if you don't mind, we'll take a little bit longer on your family tree because it's slightly more complicated.
Absolutely. Well, I'm delighted to be here as well, and it's great to be here with Gerry and Kerri. My family tree, well, essentially the Royal Irish Constabulary was the name given to the police force in the whole of Ireland, we'll say, in the leading up to 1922, so before partition. And my grandfather was born in County Kerry. They had a tradition of posting people who were in the police force as far away as possible from home so that they wouldn't know anybody locally and wouldn't have conflicts of interest. So my grandfather, being from Kerry, was posted to the north of Ireland, as it would have been called then, and he got on reasonably well for the first couple of years because he was in areas with Catholic majorities. But then in 1922, he had a dilemma. The RIC was being folded up. A new RUC was being established, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and a new Garda Síochána in the south. So two new police forces reflecting the political division of the island in that year. And he opted for the RUC, which, as a Kerry Catholic, was not the best career move he could have made, as it turned out, because he then found himself posted to a town with a solid unionist majority, and therefore he never made it above the rank of sergeant. But anyway, that's history, Gerry.
And just briefly on that, your father grew up in Warrenpoint, County Down, which became infamous on the day that Lord Mountbatten was blown up by the IRA off the coast of Sligo. 18 British soldiers were blown up in Warren Point on the same day. So that gives you the context of where your father was a policeman, your grandfather, and then your father couldn't wait to get out of Northern Ireland. Once he hit 18, I'm out of here and I'm not coming back.
Yeah, he was brought up in the RUC barracks. That was the family home, and he resented, to be honest, the treatment of his father, which he could see, and this is now in the 30s, 40s. He resented greatly the discrimination against his father because of being a Catholic from the south, and so it affected my own father's political views, and he never really felt reconciled to Northern Ireland until, in a way, at the very, very end of his life.
Now, you perhaps might be able to judge by the grey hairs at either side that Kerri is lucky enough to be way younger
I have quite
than
a
us.
lot as well.
And you were born in 1983, but if there's a classic illustration of how deep the divisions, you were born in Derry, the cradle of the Troubles and the Civil Rights Movement and everything else, but your family situation made you particularly vulnerable in a way because your dad was a young Protestant, and your mother was a young Catholic. The two didn't mix. They clearly did mix. You're the proof. And then you had to live the first 10, 11 years of your life over on the Protestant side of the city. So tell us what that was like.
So I'm first child of teenage parents, mixed marriage in Derry, 1983. The exact midway point of the Troubles, so the complete halfway point, and spent the first 11 years, the first 7 years, from 4 till 11, living in a predominantly impoverished Protestant housing estate. My parents divorced. There's a lot of intergenerational fractures.
You can only begin to imagine the pressure from both sides in the middle of the Troubles.
And in the middle of quite an impoverished household. And my mother was obviously Catholic. My mother stayed with us in our family home. And as soon as the Protestant moved out of the house, we were kind of naturally a target. There's sort of increased housing need as well during that time. So there was a really interesting relationship between political views and political needs. So there was a lot of kind of trying to get families that weren't quite wanted in the area out in and around them.
And you describe in some detail just how horrific it was. You were only 11 when you were asleep at night and your house was firebombed because you were now a Catholic family, no longer with a Protestant father living in a Protestant area. And you were lucky to get out. It was only because a stray cat had turned up a week. So tell us that story, because you saw something, your love and depth of knowledge of nature and what nature can tell us. That cat was an early forebringer of what they can tell us.
I mean, I've kind of always had this very interesting relationship with wild animals, and it's kind of guided me through. But the petrol bomb was thrown in my window because it was at the back of the house. So it's thrown from the back square by a gang of teenage boys who we knew. And this kind of stray cat scratched at my face until I woke up and we all got out of the house.
And we have a lot more to come into, so I'll just summarise the next year as relatively shortly. So, burned out of a Protestant area, the housing executive had to find you accommodation. You're now basically a Catholic family again. So let's put you into the Catholic area in Derry, the other side of the city. And even then, a lot of suspicion.
Well, both of us, both myself and my brother, were both obviously in a Protestant primary school. So we moved, sort of more or less as the crow flies in a straight line across the river that did divide, still somewhat does, Derry from Protestant to Catholic. We moved into Catholic area and were able to shield those really interesting questions that children ask each other in Derry, or did when I was younger, about, what team do you support, and what this and what that, and those kind of interesting things. And then one day my brother had been playing football at my granny's church every sort of Saturday, and one time the minibus dropped him off, and it sort of said, Waterside, Londonderry, or something along those lines.
So you were identified then clearly as being from the other side. We'll come back to your next move because I want to bring David back in. So we've got to Kerri in the sort of early 90s.
Yeah.
Now, in the mid-80s, you had a very interesting job in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. You joined in 1975, did a little bit of work on Anglo-Irish relations, including in 1975, your first job was studying maps because there was a possibility that there would be a mass exodus of Catholics from Northern Ireland because of the level of violence following the collapse of the Sunningdale Agreement. So that brought home to you, things are really bad up there.
Exactly, Jerry. I mean, it sounds almost a bit surreal at this stage, but in the mid-70s, there was a real fear that a very large number of Catholics would be forced to move across the border because there would be a complete breakdown of law and order. There was nothing happening on the political front in the mid-70s. There was a sense of despair, and so we were literally planning for the practical implications of maybe 100,000 Catholics coming across. And of course, I should say, of course, for the benefit of others, we use the term lightly Catholic. I mean, it's a nationalist, really, but it's just for ease of labelling, we'll say 100,000 Catholics. Yeah.
And so while I was based in Belfast in the mid-80s, you were sneaking around Northern Ireland.
Well, I wouldn't say...
Being called a traveller
yes.
because the Department of Foreign Affairs decided we've got to establish better contacts with people across Northern Ireland from all sections of the community. And so you were in your car a lot, not a Southern registered car, but trying to build up contacts in real communities on both sides of the divide.
I mean, the background was that we had this Anglo-Irish agreement which was agreed between Margaret Thatcher and Gareth Fitzgerald, the then Irish Prime Minister.
In 1985.
In 1985.
And led to chaos on the streets
it
afterwards.
meant that basically the Irish government had to kind of up its game in terms of understanding what was happening in Northern Ireland and not merely making speeches denouncing it. So we were really expected to have a much more detailed knowledge of the various issues on the ground. That meant that, officials like myself were asked to travel around Northern Ireland trying to make contacts. It could be on issues like fair employment or human rights or economic matters. In my case, I had to focus a lot on security and legal matters. But the idea was to build up our expertise so that when it came to making proposals to the British government for how Northern Ireland should be better administered, we would know what we were talking about and we would have the benefit of actual contact with people on the ground. Now, it tended to be people, frankly, in the STLP or priests.
But there's an amusing story where you probably quite rightly assumed that all your conversations were going to be taped by the intelligence services. So there was one priest that you saw as a good source of information, but he'd come up with a code name for how you would have these telephone calls. But the cover was fairly quickly blown.
This was a bit amateurish. Let's just say that he was in a position where he was fairly sure his phone was being tapped, and he proposed that he would pretend to be somebody who was interested in a visit from a vacuum cleaner salesman. And so he gave me a name. He said, "You'll be Mr. Brown and I'll be Mr. White." I sometimes get it wrong. And but I thought this was a bit bizarre, and I said, "Is it really necessary?" He said, "Oh, it really is necessary. It's just to fox them, to throw them off the scent a bit." So then that was fine. A couple of weeks later, I ring up and I'm talking to his housekeeper, and I say, "This is Mr. Brown. I'm in the area, and I have a new vacuum cleaner to show Mr. White." And so he then comes out ready to jump into his new role, and the next thing is he said, I said to him, "When will I come round? What about, say, 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon?" He says, "Oh, 5, that's fine." No, for 5 won't work because I have to say Mass then. Oh, so Mr. White, on his first outing, in the first sentence, had said he was about to say Mass. So I burst out laughing, but nevertheless, he insisted on keeping up this subterfuge for a few years after that. So.
I want to make sure there'll be plenty of time for questions. So I want to now go to Kerri in the early 90s. So Derry isn't working on either side of the divide. Your mum has a new partner who comes from a village outside, about 20 miles outside, called Ballykelly. And in your early teens, for about 3 or 4 years, suddenly, despite it being a mixed village, it almost was like a normal village. Like you said, people asking, "Do you like Nirvana?" why you're a vegetarian rather than which side are you from.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit in the green room earlier, that things don't exist in a vacuum, but they also do. So there is this sense of, in my book, I look at the fact that context is really important with the Troubles. So things are intergenerational, they are in our blood and in our DNA, but what can happen is we have the ability to very quickly make decisions that can take us out with those quite tight constraints. So Ballykelly was, sort of half an hour on the bus, not that far from Derry City. The people who I was then growing up around would have had similar enough context, the same music, the same sort of clothing style, but they hadn't grown up with that level of sort of terrifying claustrophobia that I had. And I was really touched by that, just that there was another way.
But unfortunately, in terms of your own life development, and there's lots of twists to come after your Ballykelly years, but one of your best friends, a close boy who you were friendly with, was brutally murdered. Now, it's not clear if there was a sectarian element to it, but it was a particularly brutal event, which
horrific.
totally shocked this small community in the way in which it happened and who was arrested for it. So do you want to just give an outline of that? Because it shattered that few years of peace, if you like.
So thank you for asking. I think even speaking of him honours him in a way that I feel glad for.
Life and soul of the village. He was a really decent guy. Everybody respected him.
And at the beginning, there was a real sort of view that it was in some way sectarian. I mean, the British Army did have a presence in Ballykelly. Ballykelly was as well as being this kind of somewhat idyllic space, it also did have an element of suffocation in it. The British Army were still posted there. So there was a while where it was thought, but very soon a different route was gone down, and some local people were held and not able to be charged. So it's still an unsolved murder.
Yeah. And then by this stage, unfortunately, your mother's situation had changed again. And one of the stoic and most important characters in your early life was your grandfather. And you went back, your brother and yourself went back to live with him. And he sounds like a tremendous old school character who was just caring, sharing, had time for everybody within the community as well, and wanted to help people. And certainly played a large part in getting you through your A-levels, even if you had adult chickenpox at the time. Things couldn't be tough enough.
Yeah, I ended up, I have quite bad chronic disorder. So that was kind of part of my adulthood. And again, there's a lot of studies done around trauma, how trauma manifests in the body, how we hold it in our core.
Well, there's a lot in this book about it, and we'll come on to a bit of it, but your history would certainly live up to the question of trauma and how long it lives, and intergenerationally how important it is as a legacy, which is something that on the political side they were looking at as well.
That's something that I feel really strongly for, and I'm a real advocate of making space for all that intergenerational trauma holds. And actually in the book I look at how that we feel that we're well removed. People would say, some people who've read my story actually would say, oh, there's no way all of that could have happened to her. She's too young. That didn't really happen, And actually, so there still is this sense of we want to remove ourselves from something very difficult. We want to make jokes about it. I was on a panel recently with a really incredible writer who said, at his time working with a national broadcaster, if he was Catholic and someone was Protestant, and they there was this assumption that, we can all make jokes about this. We can call each other sort of jokey names and this will make us removed from it. But actually, it doesn't. We hold trauma. It runs through families. It runs through communities. It ripples. There are people who are 18 who are living in Derry who will still be holding things that the generations before them passed on.
We're going to come on to that, because that's something, again, is very strong in it. But you did hold in things, and you were seen by some of your friends, limited pool of friends when you'd gone to university in Dublin and then went to Edinburgh to work, as being quite cold, and that you reserved so much because of what you'd gone through. So I want to just take us a little bit. We'll go from your Dublin experience in a moment back to David, because if we jump forward a little bit now, you've worked in various aspects of the Dublin diplomatic service, but by the mid-90s, you were asked to head up what became known as the Anglo-Irish Secretariat, which is where a bunch of Dublin civil servants, very controversially, since the mid-80s, were based in basically what was you describe as almost like a quasi-prison on the outskirts of Belfast within an army barracks. And certainly in the early days, it was regarded as, a hostile presence, and you'd have huge protests. But you spent 4 years heading up that department, leading up to 1998. You describe in the book just how mundane, how routine it must have been, because it was a very, nondescript office block, basically, and you all had to live, eat, sleep, and occasionally were allowed out to walk around the perimeter.
That's the Jerry. Well, in fact, it was officially in a building called Maryfield, but we called it the bunker. It wasn't actually underground, but it was heavily fortified, and it was on the sort of the grounds of Palace Barracks, just outside Belfast. So why were we there? Because I go back to the Anglo-Irish Agreement I mentioned a moment ago from 1985. The feeling was that that would only be taken seriously by the nationalist population in Northern Ireland if there was a physical presence of the Irish government in Belfast. So you can imagine that the nationalists welcomed that and the unionists hated it. And that's why, for security reasons, the Irish officials concerned had to be housed in this particular building. It was actually the office. There were British officials there as well, but they didn't have to live in the same building. They lived outside. So it was a very nondescript building, like a prefab almost, and that was home for about maybe 13 years, I think, from 1985 until 1999.
And you were there for 4 years.
I was there for the last 4 years, and I closed it.
And you couldn't really go outside that. I mean, occasionally you were allowed to go to the beach, but sort of under security. But
well, not to swim, but
you were allowed to sort of walk around.
Exactly.
Now, the only good thing which came out of that, and this was a clever move, you happened to bring a really good chef from Dublin.
Well, yes, there weren't too many people in the vicinity offering to come in and work in this place, which was seen as a den of iniquity. So we had to bring our own, chef. We had to bring our own
cook. But he worked his way up to be a chef.
But he then had a lot of time off, so they improved their skills over the years. To be honest, there was a serious point. We wanted actually gradually to bring in all sides of the community in Northern Ireland. We wanted, as it were, to understand the concerns and issues that they had. When I say we, I meant the British officials as well, that they were seen to be an advantage in opening the doors. We still weren't able to get unionists to come in because they felt that it was politically anathema to them. But we were able to get, people from all other walks of life, and that would be in the later 90s, and that's why we needed the chef, to be honest.
So we're going to freeze you in time for a second before we come to the crucial events of those final few weeks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, because I just want to bring Kerri's story up to date, because you were still a teenager in Ballykelly when this was happening, and the sense of excitement that peace in some form was on its way. You got yourself down to Trinity in Dublin in the early 2000s. Yeah. It was a very difficult time at Trinity for you, basically because of class, I suppose. You didn't have any support. Yeah. So you had to work at multiple jobs when other posher, well-to-do Trinity students were having nice long holidays. Yeah. And of course, you were from the north. And I know a lot of northerners did go to Trinity, but not from your type of background. Yeah. And you found Dublin strange and expensive.
I find it very difficult. And I think as well, this is where we could sort of bring in that sense of my story is my story, but it also speaks to a lot more worldwide, because people are still, and we were talking about this earlier, people are still experiencing someone in one part of, let's just say, someone in Hebden Bridge, I was there this morning, would not really have an awful lot of clue about some of the things that might be happening in Bradford, for instance. So there is this sense of
dislocation.
Our stories are so individual, and that's why it's really important to make room for stories that hold. So Trinity, I found Trinity very difficult. a lot of estrangement in my family, as you say, so I didn't have an awful lot of support. It was very expensive living there. We were part of the Celtic Tiger at that stage.
You had to move 10 times into fairly grotty flats. Anybody familiar with Dublin would know it's a very expensive city to live in.
The housing crisis was beginning.
People who were drug addicts were kicking in windows and everything else. It wasn't your ordinary...
No, it wasn't easy.
Right. And actually, the other thing that struck me about when on your journey to Trinity was the first time in ages that your dad had got back in touch with you, and he actually drove you down to Trinity. And there was that moment where, you know, for a few hours you were together again. And now in later years you've been able to spend more time, less so with your mother, I think it's fair to say.
I think that's something that I was really keen on in writing the book, is that I feel like the stories that are really important right now, when we talk about the legacy of the Troubles, are those stories where families have been caught in something and where one person... So it's, you know, there's that meme of all the lit matches and what's going to happen if you take one match out of that line. Does anyone have the answer? I'm in teaching mode. Well, obviously the match... The fire stops, and so there's that
She's
sense
a teacher,
of...
by the way, so sit up at the back.
But it's just that sense of, you know, and we're hearing it again and again across the world, just this idea, especially in parenting, just in the ideology around sort of very good mindful parenting, which is something I'm really into at the moment, how parenting can actually give us a way into working with trauma that is intergenerational, and how we hold power to step out. And so in the book, that's something I look at really closely.
And towards the end of the book, against your better judgment in some ways, because you said once you had finished in Dublin, you then went to Edinburgh, and you were also in Bristol and places. I'm never going back to Derry. That's the last place. But you do go back to Derry. And you have interesting reflections on where the peace deal signed by and negotiated by people like David has got to 20, 25 years later. I'm keeping an eye on my time because this is about the Good Friday Agreement, and I think 30 minutes in we should mention the Good Friday Agreement. So, David, this was going on for months, years, and so the final 9 months leading up to April 1998 is what the book is about. But let's condense it to those final 36 hours because, as I said at the introduction, it was touch and go. Each side was trying to negotiate the best possible outcome they could. Let's look at some of the key characters, right? Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, the Irish Prime Minister, they had a good working relationship, although there would be differences of emphasis in the text that they wanted to see through. Bertie Ahern's mother had died earlier in the week, so he was going to funerals back and forth. And in a strange way, his bereavement and his willingness to keep coming back earned a degree of respect from the official Unionist Party, led by David Trimble, who were the main negotiators for the Unionist community.
Absolutely, Jerry. There's a lot there. I mean, first of all, it wasn't obvious that the two prime ministers would even need to come to the talks. I mean, all going well, we would have been able to reach an agreement at a level below. But then things ran into difficulty in the previous sort of 2 or 3 weeks, and so eventually it was decided that Blair and Ahern should turn up. They hoped to resolve things within a day. In fact, it stretched to 3 days. And in any negotiation, you just can't anticipate exactly how it's going to turn out. So it turned out a lot of the time, in fact, was spent on a set of issues which, in the final scheme of things, were not that important. But we spent I mean, okay, the way in which north-south bodies on the island of Ireland, that's to say, organisations which would promote, let's say, an all-Ireland environmental policy or waterways policy. There were a number of things like this which we needed as part of the agreement. There was a practical argument to be made for these north-south bodies, but there was also a political argument. The nationalists wanted the political, they made the political case that if the Irish constitution was going to be changed in order to remove 2 articles which Unionists objected to, then in exchange for that there had to be something fairly significant by way of institutions on the north-south basis which would compensate for that. So the Nationalists therefore wanted to have a fairly ambitious set of north-south bodies. The Unionists were basically saying, we'll give you a small amount, but but not what you would like. And they also wanted these bodies to be under the authority of the future Parliament in Northern Ireland, or the Assembly. I won't...
No, there's a lot to unpack, but just in terms of where we are now, it's kind of important to remember that the people who are sitting around that negotiating table as the two lead representatives for the unionist side and the nationalist side, so the official unionists under David Trimble, the SDLP is the Constitutional Nationalists under John Hume, but really his deputy Seamus Mallon, who did all the negotiation. They are no longer the most important players, because by the 2000s, and this is something you reflect on when you go back to Derry, they've been squeezed out by the extremes. The DUP under Ian Paisley at the time were not involved in these talks. They were literally outside shouting at the building and holding press conferences when inside,
that's right,
not only the official Unionist Party, but representatives of the loyalist paramilitary parties were also in trying to negotiate a deal.
If I may say, Jerry, there were maybe 3 or 4 big issues that had to be resolved after the week. One of them is the North-South bodies I was talking about. Another was the so-called issue of decommissioning. And for those of you who don't know the term, that really means what to do with the weapons of terrorist organisations who, strictly speaking, no longer need them because they have decided to go for peaceful politics. So that had been an issue which had been percolating along for a few years before that. We frankly felt that the Unionists had elevated it to an extent that wasn't warranted. I mean, put it like this, if the IRA's view was we have volunteered a ceasefire in 1994 and
broke it in 96.
They broke in 96 and then they restored it in 97. But so their point of view was it was a voluntary act on our part to have a ceasefire. We think it's, as it were, over egg in the pudding to require that we come in with our hands up with the weapons surrendered. I'm not offering a view on that, simply saying that was their psychology. The Unionists, on the other hand, would say, yeah, but the very fact that you are equivocating that you don't want to hand the weapons over suggests that perhaps you intend one day to use them again. So these were 2 valid points of view, but the problem was that the Unionists wanted to make their point of view a condition before anything else would happen.
And can I bring Kerri back in to jump forward now to when you're back in Derry? Yeah. So you went back in Easter 2015.
Yeah.
And you were reflecting in 2017 as a quite interesting test of was this new peace deal, was it going to last? Because you said there was a bombing at the beginning of the year outside the courthouse. Yeah. A few seconds earlier would have killed a few lads who were walking past it. There was rioting. There was the journalist Lyra McKee who was shot dead when there was rioting going on. And the death of Martin McGuinness, who was a central figure with Gerry Adams negotiating for Sinn Féin. And your section on Martin McGuinness, is very interesting because you say he did change things.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very important to remember that at every stage of this Good Friday agreement, the most important thing has been individuals. And I think we forget this. We're living in a late capitalist society. We're living in a world that would want us to be replaced by computers, would want us to be replaced by organisation in boxes. And I think that what's very important for the Good Friday Agreement is to remember that the need for a Good Friday Agreement was about individuals. It became a thing because of individuals, and the good work that has happened in the aftermath since peace was tentatively shaped and is still beholden, is done by individuals. So what I was reflecting on in the book is the period of time of living in Derry at that quite turbulent time where peace is so delicate. Peace anywhere is so delicate. We have to guard it. We have to guard it as it is the most important thing in existence.
And you had a very good line, actually, about McGuinness had gone from planting bombs to planting seeds of hope.
Yeah, and I feel like, and it's interesting in lots of, and we all, the thing is, human beings suffer. They make mistakes, but they also hold power that the more than human race, the more than human species that we live with don't hold that power, and I think we hold responsibility through that power.
And just to give, go ahead,
Jerry. Could I just echo Kerri's point about the importance of personal relationships? And I knew Martin McGuinness, and I absolutely agree with Kerri. I'm not going to try and sanctify him, but the truth is that Martin McGuinness was quite personable. You wouldn't necessarily expect this, but he had relationships across the divide. I'll give you one simple example. That you may have heard the name of General John Dochartaigh, who was a Canadian general who was actually central to the efforts to get this decommissioning issue resolved. Martin McGuinness struck up a rapport with this Canadian general, which you wouldn't necessarily have expected, and that did make its own contribution to finally resolving that problem. Another thing would be Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair. They established a remarkable rapport, which frankly we don't see nowadays, and I won't personalise it. And that was remarkable. We also had George Mitchell, who was this extremely talented and impartial American senator who was really from central casting. So we were fortunate that we had Blair, Ahern, Mitchell, with Clinton behind. Trimble, look, to be honest, was a complex character, David Trimble.
He was difficult
but
to deal
he
with.
was very
one.
Yeah, he always was.
And at several points, 2 or 3 points, which I mentioned in my book, even those of us who were wary of him had to recognise that he took a crucial fork in the road, and without him, there would be no Good Friday Agreement. So we were fortunate that there was a sort of a cast of characters. Well, by today's standards, it's very odd, almost no women. I mean, it is very...
Well, there was the Women's Coalition who've been
Very
elected.
important.
You actually several occasions you refer to them as honest brokers, Monica McWilliams, and they were really important. And obviously Mo Molan.
Exactly. Mo was a very special character. She was...
Although she was marginalised by Blair at this crucial moment. That was well known in Westminster.
The difficulty was that traditional unionists eyed her with suspicion. They couldn't really take her very exuberant personality, and they suspected that she had more of a sympathy in the direction of republicanism. They suspected that. But either way, she was a one-off, and she also was very courageous. She visited the Maze prison to see loyalist prisoners a couple of months ahead of the agreement. That was quite an unusual thing for a British minister to do at the time. So she deserves a huge amount of credit, and I'm glad that in the recent anniversary celebrations she got a lot of that credit.
I was recently I was one of the Northern Irish heroines, and it was at Stormont, and I was in the room with all of the women that were part of the community holding within Derry and Belfast during the run-up to the agreement, and even earlier. And I'll tell you what, you talk about powerful, to listen to women. And I think we need to remember this if we really think about trauma, and if we think about conflict and emergency, and if you look worldwide, and I'm not genderist in any way, and I'm very open to how gender works, but what you will find is generally the people who play integral roles that don't get spoken of that much are women. They're often mothers.
Yeah,
and let's be really honest about it. There would have been no Good Friday Agreement without mothers, and I find it quite moving, even the fact that a mother died during that. That someone who was really, we've heard about this in the Black Lives Movement quite movingly during the pandemic, where a number of very violent things happened, and stuff that shouldn't have happened. And if you talk to people, things that moved them were the last words of people very often when they're dying, especially during violence. People ask for their mother, no matter even if they're not even in contact with them. And I think there's something about trauma and bloodlines and how we can actually really look at care as a way forward, because human beings, that we want to care for people.
I'm just going to ask one final question to David before opening it up, and it's in relation to another mother who played a very important role within the SDLP, and that was Breed Rogers, who went on to become an MP as well. There's an amusing tale as the final hours are clocking down, more and more heavy-looking men start turning up to the respective delegations to sign off the deal, basically. And Breed Rogers had a strange encounter in one of these corridors.
Yeah, no, it was the sort of slightly shadowy figures suddenly appeared on the last day who were not the normal delegates. So we put two together and worked out that both Sinn Féin and then the two loyalist parties were getting additional people in who were probably from the more militant side of their movements, and who wanted to give their blessing, or we hoped that they would give their blessing to what was about to be agreed. So there were these unknown characters, and it happened that Breed Rogers of the SDLP saw one gentleman nearby who had a balaclava on him, and so this seemed to conform to the normal stereotype of the balaclava terrorist. Turned out that he was just delivering a pizza. It was a very cold evening. It was kind of snowy, and he was on his bike, and he had to have a balaclava on.
I just happened to have a balaclava with me.
So she relaxed a bit when she realised somebody had ordered in a few pizzas because we had no food, and that's why he was there. But you need.
But again, apart from the detail and the tension of those negotiations, you get those wonderful vignettes, as they say, from within the building, and they bring to life just the reality of what people are experiencing moment by moment. So listen, let's have a few questions. There is a mic which Theo had. It doesn't have to be just about the Good Friday Agreement or where we are now. It can be more about Kerri's book, which has a lot of nature and particularly about birds, I think, and moths and butterflies. So it's a broad discussion. Feel free. Sorry, go ahead and wait till the mic, please, and away we go.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Hello. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. I missed the first part of this talk. So as I was at John Pilger's thing, which is
come on. Whoever heard of him?
Right. So my impression is that since the signing of the agreement and so on, the British government has rather let things slide in a way, and that the forces of progress in Northern Ireland are now being held to ransom by an increasingly powerless unionist who are just sticking their feet in and just saying, look, we'll just piss in the well. And
I'll get an answer from both, because Kerri, I want to start with you, because towards the end of your book, when you're back in Derry again, Brexit has really damaged inter-community relations within Northern Ireland, and we're familiar with the endless discussions about the protocol, how that was going to work, but you've seen it on the ground, that those old tensions are beginning to simmer away again.
So the north of Ireland was quite interesting in that across the political divide, people voted to remain in Europe. And a lot of there's a lot of alcoholism still in the north. There's a lot of gambling is a big problem. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of teenage pregnancy,
and unfortunately a lot of
suicide. Breastfeeding rates are at an all-time low. These are These are the traces of trauma. It's a legacy of loss. And a lot of the support, the non-community run sort of voluntary support, that continues, but a lot of the real support for those kind of issues would have come from Europe rather than the UK. So of course that was all pulled. So what's happening in impoverished areas, particularly maybe just slightly outside Belfast and in Derry City, is that there's a real a supposed political stance being taken. There's a lot of sort of eruption of problems again in those areas, but actually these aren't really political problems with a capital P, even though everything is politics. These are problems of leftover trauma that the government, the British government, is not really kind of aware of.
The question made the point about the unionists sort of standing outside the executive president, but of course Sinn Féin have done it sometimes. You must be disappointed, though, as one of the negotiators. 14 out of 25 years the Assembly hasn't sat?
Nobody could have foreseen Brexit or anything even remotely like that. In fact, if anything, that was one of the strongest values we had in common in 1998, that both countries were in the EU and would be staying there. So the effect of Brexit was that the DUP, that's the main unionist party now, voted to leave the EU. Sinn Féin, the SDLP, and we suspect a lot of moderate unionists would have voted to stay. The latter group felt disenfranchised because the view, the way it was totted up was that the UK as a whole, the vote in the UK as a whole was what counted. So the people who had voted to stay in feel betrayed, and that has carried over into the relations between the two communities. Frankly, it has carried over into the relations between the two governments, because the Irish government clearly was unhappy with Brexit, still is. In a more positive vein, I think the current British government is in a more pragmatic mode. The Windsor framework, I think, will help. And at the moment, what we're looking at is a situation in which we're waiting for the DUP, led by Jeffrey Donaldson, to go back into the Assembly, to go back into the other institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. And my guess is that they will do that sooner rather than later, because frankly there's nowhere else to go. I mean, the business community in Northern Ireland are all too aware that investment opportunities are being lost. Even people in Britain are unhappy at the instability in Northern Ireland. So a lot of unionist interests are being adversely affected by the current boycott. So I would be reasonably hopeful that that eventually they will go back in.
Okay, let's take a few more questions up at the front. If you could, Theo, gentleman in the front row, and then behind you, and then we'll try and get a few more in as quickly as we can. Thanks.
So I wanted to ask your thoughts about Lord Ashcroft's poll, which seemed to suggest that the majority of people sort of working age or below 45 were either kind of ambivalent or supportive of reunification. But once you move to kind of retirement age, then it was sort of heavily against. Do you see kind of the younger folks becoming more like the older generation as they age?
Let's ask the youngest member of the panel, and then you can throw in about these polls vary, of course.
I think that's a very good question, and I think that it's contextual and that it speaks to much wider sort of experiences than just that of the island of Ireland. So I feel like we're moving into a very interesting position when it comes to what people view as home, what people view as a safe future. It involves things like, I mean, you were talking about sort of north-south ideas in and around, so there's a lot of different policies in the north than what there are in the south, in and around the protection of rivers, for instance, the protection of hedgerows. So I think that we're speaking to something that goes beyond just the sense of a landmass, something that looks at, people are really wondering about where our place is in the climate emergency, in the housing emergency. And we really need to think about what is left over from the Good Friday Agreement that is still holding us safely, and how do we protect that? Because I think what we need to think about is how different it would have looked, for instance, pandemic or Brexit, had we not got that safe hold of the Good Friday Agreement. How would my generation be feeling had they not experienced what it was like to, for a while, feel safe?
Briefly on that, and then we'll go to
Yeah, I mean, there were many different polls, and I think broadly speaking, it's safe to say that there's still a majority in Northern Ireland against reunification, but there would still be a majority in the south in favour of it. However, as I say, polls in themselves can vary. The key thing is that I don't think that either government will move towards the referendum which is envisaged under the Good Friday Agreement. It's called, by the way, a border poll. I think that neither government will have an interest in moving towards that unless and until they sense almost that there would be a clear majority in favour of Irish unity in both parts of the island. The Good Friday Agreement merely says that there can be a poll, but it doesn't say when that should happen. And I think what's more important in a way is what, for example, the Irish government is doing at the moment. They're trying to create sort of a shared island approach, which means that there'll be a lot of practical cooperation between North and South. For example, the Irish government is co-funding the building of a motorway in Northern Ireland and lots of other things, infrastructure.
Including some student grants. And
so there's a lot of practical cooperation which will, it's valuable on its own, but of course it promotes a kind of benign approach. It will tend to bring the two parts of Ireland more closer together. So in a way, this shared island approach, I think, is necessary, needs to be developed before we would pop the question, as it were. And the question will be popped, I think, in heavily prepared and controlled circumstances. I think nobody wants a situation in which the question is popped and there's a negative.
I think Brexit is a good example of it's easy to ask the question, but working out what it means in reality and in
totally.
practicality
Yeah.
is very, very different business. Sarah, you were waiting patiently there. Yeah, the mic is with you now.
Okay, probably a question for Kerri. I was in Northern Ireland, I was in Belfast from 1971 till 76, partly as a trainee clinical psychologist. So I was dealing a lot, massively. We were working till 10, 12 at night, dealing with trauma cases, psychological trauma.
Yeah.
I went back 5 years ago,
Yeah.
and I was aware that the friends I met were still suffering from trauma. And I can feel it in myself. I lived in Murder Mile for a time. Somebody mentioned that the British government wasn't doing enough about this. I can't see this as being a role for government. I think to some degree the Good Friday Agreement exacerbated the sense of trauma, particularly of those that suffer from the IRA. But the solution is not, I think, going to lie with simply producing more therapists. It needs something much more radical, or thinking outside the box and how to deal with it.
I would agree.
So yes, I would be interested in your views on that.
I would firmly agree. Trauma is one of my areas of interest. I'm quite into it, and I'm quite into how we can move in ways that are healing and that are regenerative and that lead us towards grace and joy, because all flourishing is mutual. Robin Wall Kimmerer, this incredible sort of writer and mother, writes about the natural world, and I suppose that where I come from, if you get a chance to read my book, where I come from in my book is just this sense of every day is a choice. As anyone, but as a survivor of extreme trauma, every day that I get up is a choice. Every day that I keep going is a choice. And for me, the way through trauma was quite multi-layered.
And it's fair to say it did take a long time. That is the
I'm
nature
still
of it, because
healing, every day.
It's not one day you flick a switch and suddenly everything is forgotten.
Trauma, the whole sense, trauma can't go. So it's that sort of age-old energy can only ever be reshaped. It can't go. So what we do with what we've lived through is how we heal. And we heal anew, and bodily, a lot of work needs done. So that's why being in wild spaces is really good for me. Swimming with my son, laughing, physical touch, and
you're a great advocate for wild swimming.
Yeah,
actually, that comes out in the book.
And not nature as this cure, but just nature as this way back to self, back to being, and yeah.
Okay, thanks for that question. A few more hands, just down the back, keep you going as well. As I say, it is part memoir, but also there's much more in it, and you've heard parts of Kerri's story, but not all of it.
It's a question for Kerri as a teacher, really. Well, given that you can study history in the UK up to A level, and even quite honestly to the end of a history degree, and learn next to nothing about the history of Britain in Ireland or indeed the wider empire. Yeah. How important do you think that sort of dearth of knowledge about Irish history is in regards to on this side of the Irish Sea, in regards to the ongoing political process and the peace process?
I think story is the biggest healer that we have access to as a race. So the more that we can use story as a way into our darkness and the light that's still there, it's really huge. So you get sick of having to explain to English, Scottish, Welsh people what happened. You can see Ireland from Scotland and people don't know. And I think that actually there was this period of time where there was this sense of, oh no, that's over, we don't want to hear anymore. But thankfully we've come away from that now. So stories from Ireland have really found a good place. But I do feel like we need to use the example of the north of Ireland and bring it the whole way across the world. Yeah.
Did we have too much history in the
well, in
South?
fact,
That's the other side of it. We always learned about the
I was
English.
going to make another point, Jerry, which is that in the South, funnily enough, although we would perhaps have a greater interest in understanding everything that happened during the Troubles, recent polls suggest that actually there's a lot of ignorance, including among younger people.
Yeah.
To give you an example, just one random detail I heard, that I think it is 41% of those questioned in a recent poll in the south of Ireland thought that the British Army were responsible for the Troubles. Now, as distinct from other groups, I think most people would agree that it was IRA violence which prompted the Troubles. But the point is that for a significant number of young people, excuse me, in the South, to believe that it was the British Army suggests that we have the British Army were not maybe perfect, but on the other hand, they didn't cause the Troubles. And so that's just one perhaps trivial example of where there clearly is a lot of history that is missing in the South. I wanted to make another point as well in response to the question here about trauma, but just to say that during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations, we tried to address the issue of legacy and how you would promote reconciliation and especially the victims of violence, the victims of suffering. And the general view was that we should not, after all, go in for a South Africa type Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they obviously tried to work through many traumas. The feeling was that already some of the more controversial incidents had been investigated to one degree or another, usually inconclusively, and that if we were then to sort of extend that across the board, that we could be tied up in such investigations for 25 years to come. So, I mean, I'm summarising a long debate, perhaps too simplistically, but the gist of it was that we would avoid a South African type situation which might be ultimately too painful. I'm talking about the investigation of shoot-to-kill incidents, things like that. Instead, we would ask two distinguished people in either tradition, I think it was the Church of Ireland bishop and a leading Catholic from Derry, that they would together come up with proposals for what might be done to promote reconciliation and indeed overcome trauma.
We started 2 or 3 minutes late, so we're going to finish on time, but in 2 or 3 minutes. A lady here has a question. Theo, if you could keep your hand up just for a second so that Theo can find you, and I think that'll be wrapping up with a reminder that both books are on sale outside.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, in terms of politicians and the real people who are experiencing the Troubles, obviously your trauma, living through it as a normal person, was very different to the politician making the decisions or negotiating. How do you feel that they've related to your experience, and how do you think they interpreted what? Oh, sorry.
So that's a beautiful question. So I'll give you a really firm example of that. So the Irish government recently curated and held a commemorative event to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement, and so creatives from across the island were invited, and actually from the UK, mainland UK as well, to respond to what the Good Friday Agreement meant to them. And of course, there were lots of politicians there as well. And during the event, the performers, so the people who had lived through it, let's say there were 40 of us that were all performers. There was a screen in the room at the back, in the green room. There was a screen there, and the people we all went down individually to do our part. And when someone was gone and they were on the screen, the people who were watching the screen, who were crying, who were laughing, who were squeezing each other, were the people who'd lived through it and were talking about it. The politicians were at the bar necking pints.
Now, I would say that politicians were killed during Northern Ireland Troubles, and also had to live with 24-hour protection. And I'm going to finish with a story about somebody else who faced a threat directly to his life and to his family. Because on the very morning that the Good Friday Agreement was signed off, what happened to you?
Well, I touched on it in my book. I mean, this sort of thing went with the turf. I was in a very exposed position in Northern Ireland because I was effectively like the head of the Irish government office in Northern Ireland. So there was a group at the time called the Loyalist Volunteer Force who were not on a ceasefire, and they had regularly threatened me in my position in this Maryfield Secretariat. So they did so again on the last day, and it was just ironic that at the very moment, it was actually the afternoon, at the very moment when we had got the Good Friday Agreement through and people were celebrating and hugging and kissing, at that very moment I got news of different kind, and so I mentioned that in the book.
No, well, actually, you were told that there was a direct threat to your life and it was going to be carried out as a paid hit job in Dublin.
Yeah.
And you had to go down to Dublin and say, we've achieved, to tell your wife and family, and now we've got to move because we're under direct threat of being killed.
Anyway, happily, there was a good outcome. So a month later, the organisation in question declared a ceasefire. So.
Oh, not that David Donoghue just said no.
But I think I misunderstood. I thought we were talking about current politicians because, yes, I would mirror what Jerry said, that I would view the people involved in that whole process of that time as being ordinary people. So I think that's the difference, that now there's a different viewpoint with politics and with people who've lived through it now.
Well, look, it's been a great selection of questions, but I'm sure you'll agree it's been a fantastic engagement and such a different perspectives given. So I want to say thank you to Kerri and also to David. Both of them will be signing copies of the book outside. I'm going to get Kerri to sign, and then I'm going to get David to sign. So a round of applause for them. David, have you got a pen?
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the festival, please subscribe, share this episode with others, and leave a rating. Don't forget to mark your calendars as the Bradford Literature Festival returns for its 10th year from 28th of June to the 7th of July 2024.